Hello and welcome to the Climate Conscious Podcast. I'm your host, Dirval Bazi. And today I'm joined by Kendria Ferguson. Hi, Kendria, welcome.
Hi, thank you.
Kendria Ferguson is a native of the Bahamas and holds a bachelor's degree in marine biology from Barry University and a master's degree in global sustainability and sustainable energy from the University of South Florida. Kendria possesses expertise in sustainable development within the tourism sector, where she spearheaded one of the most expansive hotel developments in environmental management. She's also contributed to public service by formulating a national campaign to prohibit specific single-use plastics and devising strategies to enhance the integration of renewable energy in the public sector and residential landscape. She was appointed by the Bahamian government to a task force aimed at formulating post-COVID recovery strategies. She has also collaborated with local and international organizations to facilitate post-Dorian recovery and reconstruction efforts. So at the time of this recording, Hurricane Beryl has made its way through the Caribbean, impacting Barbados, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Jamaica as a Category 4 hurricane before arriving at Texas as a Category 3 hurricane. No Atlantic storm has ever grown to Category 5 strength this early in the season. This is a quote from Philip Klutzbach, a meteorologist at Colorado State University specializing in Atlantic Basin seasonal hurricane forecasts. Hurricane Beryl broke several records. It intensified from a tropical storm to a Category 5 hurricane within 48 hours, with a maximum wind speed of 160 miles per hour. It was the earliest forming Category 5 and Category 4 hurricane recorded in history, and the strongest hurricane in June and July, according to wind speed. So the Caribbean is particularly vulnerable to hurricanes, and with warming oceans, we can expect even more intense weather systems. So, Kendria, as someone who has experienced hurricanes and has been involved in recovery efforts, I want you to paint a picture for all listeners of the impact of hurricanes on Caribbean communities.
Yeah, sure. I can remember probably my first hurricane was Hurricane Andrew, which was a Category 5 that hit the Bahamas in 1992. And I was in primary school, and I remember that vividly. And for many of us in the Caribbean, we have low-lying islands, and then we also have islands that have substantial height. So volcanic islands tend to have much more height than others. And for many of us, we live along the coastline, or we live very in close proximity to the coastline. So when you have these monstrous storms coming towards us, they're coming with a lot of power. They're coming with a lot of wind. And that wind pushes shallow waters up onto the coastline. So we have a great deal of storm surge. And for us who economies are based within the coastline, that means a lot of our economic activity, our productive areas are at risk. Additionally, that means also that a lot of our communities are at risk. So it's going to be inland flooding or coastal flooding. If a lot of islands are like us in the Bahamas, our water table is also relatively very close to our ground level. So for us, when we have hurricanes, sometimes you're also dealing with storm tides, right? So we have these very extreme king tides happening at the same time a hurricane is happening. So while these tides are raising water levels, you have hurricanes that are pushing water onto land. So there's absolutely nowhere for the water to go. And so we have a lot of homes that are flooded because of that, and they're flooded for multiple times during a storm. And that was my personal experience during Hurricane Dorian. Although Hurricane Dorian impacted Abaco and Grand Bahama, where I lived in Nassau, our house was flooded two times throughout those 3 days that the islands were impacted by Hurricane Dorian. So when we look at the impacts of these hurricanes on our small islands, we're looking at not only the coastal impact and the immediate impacts on our infrastructure in those areas, but there's a lot of social impacts as well. Poverty rates in the Caribbean are rising. Cost of living is rising. The cost of electricity, food, healthcare, all of these things are rising. And because of that, a lot of families are having difficulty with meeting their needs. And so when you have these major hurricanes come, they tend to come with a big price tag. So there's damage to not only your house structure, but there's loss of furnitures. And these are the type of things that people don't actually get assistance for or are unable to access assistance for. So outside of the household and that financial impact, you also have the impact on vulnerable groups. A big part of disasters is the impact on school-age children. And we saw that after Hurricane Dorian, and I'm seeing this now on what's happened with Hurricane Beryl. A lot of the schools were damaged. So then a lot of students don't have the opportunity to go back to school after a hurricane to try and, get a sense of normalcy or a sense of social networking that they would have had previously. In Dorian, a lot of students had to leave those islands and be enrolled into other schools on different islands. And when you talk about enrolling students in different islands, then they don't have access to uniforms. They don't have access to school books or school supplies. And so then you then put them in a vulnerable situation to be bullied or to be, picked on because of that. And what we're seeing for a lot of islands happening now so early in the season is that schools did incur a lot of damage. So it's going to disrupt learning for the students for the rest of the semester. But what level of impact will it have for the coming semester? The entire summer is hurricane season and we're just starting. So how will that impact education for September? And then we also look at other vulnerable groups. We have single family households, right? So they have one source of income coming in, which means that when you talk about hurricane impacts in household structure, loss of furniture, loss of cars, disruptions in food supply, how are we going to support these families to kind of rebuild their lives after these major events? And then our community has elderly people. We have people that are unhoused. So doing to help them during this time as well. And so there's a lot of vulnerabilities when you talk about the social aspect of our islands and how hurricanes actually affect them.
Thank you so much for sharing your personal experience and also highlighting the social issues and the social vulnerabilities that they already exist in our region, but these natural disasters, these climate-related hazards just make them so much worse. And you mentioned the big price tag of hurricanes. And, when we speak about natural hazards, climate resilience, we have to talk about the economic cost. That's a question that keeps coming up in climate discussions, who bears the cost? And it also brings us to the point of, who's bearing the heavy burden of climate change. There's the immediate impact to infrastructure, but also to vulnerable groups who, when persons external to the Caribbean, they look at news reports, they may not readily consider the direct impact to single parent households, the elderly, the unhoused, and even to our children who have their education being so abruptly disrupted and disrupted for lengthy periods. But given that the anomaly of Hurricane Beryl, as I mentioned, all the records that this hurricane so early in the season has broken, given that this might become the norm as global temperatures continue to escalate, what can we really do to address the increased risk of hurricanes in our region?
Every time we talk about reducing risk and how can we become more resilient, I always ask, what does resilience actually mean? Like, how are we defining resilience? Because if the idea of resilience is that after a major hurricane, we are able to recover in a much quicker time frame, how do we measure that and recover for who? Like you mentioned, when people look from the outside in, they're looking at infrastructure damage, they're looking at GDP loss. But when you look at the household level, it takes families years to recover from a single storm. And that is a part of disasters that we're not talking about in the region. So when we want to reduce risk, I think we need to take more of a bottom-up approach, right? So we need to understand who is in our communities and what is their current social status, their current economic and financial status. Because then if you know who is in your communities, then you can best prepare in terms of interventions, right? Or recovery programs. We know that we have 10 elderly people in St. Thomas community. So we know for preparing for a storm, one of the first things we have to do is send a bus and get those elderly people out there and put them in a proper shelter. We know that we have 3,000 students in this other community. What interventions can we create on the other side of a hurricane or a flood or any other type of hazard to help support those students cope and mentally, deal with the impacts or the experiences that they just had. So by taking a bottom-up approach, we really get to understand our communities better, and we get to understand where we need to allocate resources and what financial support we need. A lot of conversations are right, who bears the cost? I leave those conversations to government because I feel like we've been having the same climate finance conversations for years, and we're not really tipping the point of what we really need to do real climate adaptation and mitigation within our countries. But for us, who really bears the cost is community members, because we tend to be so GDP focused and so infrastructure focused, that we don't consider that there are families still struggling to get back to some level of normalcy before the disaster that they had just experienced.
Well, I certainly share your disappointment slash disillusionment with the climate finance conversation. It's been years that the region's leaders have been lobbying for climate finance. And there's a lot of talk even now going into the next COP in November of this being a finance year. And they're seeking to mobilize even more climate finance. And yes, we need to do that, but we need to ensure that there are mechanisms that allows the finance to trickle down to those who need it most. And I feel like that has been missing.
When you talk about climate finance, and even, disaster risk management, one of the big things that I learned in all my years of experiencing hurricanes is that NGO and civil society plays a bigger role than sometimes government does. And that's no negative towards government. Government is they're very structured, right? So they're very stuck in certain processes, whereas civil society and NGOs tend to be much more flexible. And because of that, they are more on the ground. They know their community, but they also know where to get certain resources. And these are the people that are driving a lot of the medium and long-term recovery. Sometimes you see governments come in and, they provide aids for 2-3 months, but then what happens after that? And NGOs are the ones that remain in communities to really help people rebuild over a long period of timing. So when we talk about access to climate finance, I think we need to move away from the model of just directing finance through government and direct finance through private sector and civil society, because those are the ones that are on the ground. They have less bureaucratic processes, and they can really help get a lot of things done that tends to take governments years to do. And then oftentimes you see islands lose access to finance because we're not using it fast enough. So yeah, I think a big part of our climate resilience and disaster risk management and risk reduction conversation should involve the NGOs and the civil society and private sector stakeholders.
Recently, along with over 300 organizations, I signed on to a letter to the Loss and Damage Fund advocating for community access to those funds for the same reasons that you expressed, ensuring that small grants are available to frontline communities, Indigenous peoples, and those vulnerable groups so that they can directly access resources, removing so many of the barriers that exist.
Recently, I saw a video of work that was done in Japan. They were building a community evacuation center. And they kind of showed through the process of what they did to get to the actual finished building. And for them, that meant that they met a lot with community members, right? So they can understand what elements need to be included inside the design. So they realized that there was a lot of mothers in the community, so they needed to make sure the building had access to a ramp where people can bring strollers. There's a lot of elderly in the building, so it needed to be located in a place that was fairly walkable but easily accessible. People have pets, so how do you handle pets in those type of environments? And for me, when it comes to building resilience, sometimes you cannot save a house from damage, and that's completely understandable. But if you can make people feel safe, and feel seen and heard, then that does more for mental recovery and community culture, than anything else. And I feel like if we invest time in building these strategies that are targeted towards vulnerable groups, and building proper interventions to help them prepare for storms, that would be a very great start for us. But we also know that in our region, we're having difficulty with providing proper shelter during these events. Additionally, we're having difficulty with finding that balance between development and protecting our environment or protecting these very sensitive and ecosystems that help protect our communities. So I feel like there's a big part of building resilience for us is also being much more stricter in how we build and what type of investments we allow to be built in our communities and along our coastlines. And it may not be the popular thing to do. Some countries have actually prevented people from building along the coastline in its entirety, and they've kind of protected that element of their country, just because sea levels are rising and they're being faced with so much different hazards. But I feel like until we make those very clear and strong decisions about what we will allow and not allow from an infrastructure and development standpoint, then we're just having very empty conversations about building resilience within our communities.
I think throughout the climate conversation, it always brings us back to balancing those priorities of sustainable development, environmental protection, maintaining the integrity of our natural ecosystems while pursuing economic growth and providing access to resources and a better standard of living to our people. And also addressing all the social issues that exist that we have inherited and that continue to persist in our region. But one thing that also stands out to me is that a major element of resilience is being proactive, and it's building that capacity in our systems, our communities, and our society as a whole to anticipate, prepare for, respond to, and recover from these hazards that to a great extent we cannot escape at this point because we have been locked in. The region is already locked into these climate impacts from historical emissions. And yes, we continue to advocate for climate mitigation, but we know adaptation is where we have to really focus as a region. What would you say about the role of the international community in supporting disaster risk management and climate resilience in the Caribbean?
I think one of the big roles that they have is filling in capacity gaps. We all know throughout the region, there's a big data gap throughout our communities, right? So a lot of our communities have not been mapped. So we're not fully understanding what our flood risks are. We don't know where our vulnerable populations live. And so there's a lot of hazard-based data that we need to really put together in order for us to really develop proper risk management plans. And I feel like that's a big role that we can definitely use international assistance with. And then also we have the challenge of collecting timely data. So we would do one study in 2020, and then we won't do it again no more till like 2030. So getting access to timely data is very important when you're talking about understanding risk and risk reduction and putting in proper plans because people's circumstances change. The environments change when you talk about population increase and development projects. So we need to constantly be updating that data management tool that we use within our countries in order to inform our decisions when it comes to these two major strategies. Another thing I think international community and other Caribbean nations can really help and support with is I am very much so admire SEDIMA's response mechanism, right? Their ability to coordinate across islands and bring together expertise, bring together aid is commendable. And to be honest, it's really been helping reduce a lot of the stress on governments in recent years. And so I think there's a big role in international community for that. And I saw that after Dorian, and I'm seeing it now after Beryl. A lot of the international community is rushing to provide aid. And I think that is so important when it comes to if we're going to talk about having conversations about doing your fair share, maybe this is an element of doing your fair share that we need to put on that table. The ability for them to come prepared with aid supplies, with building supplies, with funding, that has greatly helped a lot of communities and will definitely help more communities to come. So I think those are two key areas that we really need to engage the international community on. Acknowledge that we don't have all the answers, but we do need international help with filling in some of those gaps. And for us, that is probably a big part of our resilience story that we have not really paid more attention to.
On the topic of data, which is always an issue, we have a lot of development agencies in the region doing work collecting data. And I think we need to do a better job at collating and managing that data and making it accessible so that we don't have to duplicate efforts and that
Yeah.
we can actually apply the data that exists. But we have so much research, so much data being collected in different pockets. That is a gap that could be closed in terms of better management and access to data to help our resilience and recovery efforts to be data driven.
Yeah, definitely. I think also, after we have disaster events throughout the region, we need to be sharing those lessons, right? So there should be a post-event conversation about how an island was impacted, how a community was impacted, and what were the key lessons and needs from those type of events. The sharing of data is definitely much needed. If there was a central place that governments and the public can access data, I think that will greatly help people also work on their own personal resilience plans within their families. I don't think we like to collect data, but we don't like to share it with our communities. We don't educate our communities enough so that they can fully understand the risks that are ahead. And then, and because of that, people don't prepare probably to the extent that they probably could have. So I feel like there's a big part of it is really educating our community on the actual risks that exist and spending time so that it is integrated not only in the household and at the community level, but it is integrated within our curriculums. And I think that will definitely help build resilience as well.
Again, a lot of the data resides in our regional institutions, but I think that their scope should be expanded to include a lot more public education so that to ensure that the population, the layman understands where we are, understands the risks that we face directly, even before they experience it, and they are able to make certain decisions to build their individual and their personal or their family resilience, because we have to tackle this thing at all levels. So, on the topic of post-disaster recovery, how do you think we can ensure that recovery efforts are more effective and also more equitable?
So I think a lot of what governments are looking at now is how do we fund recovery? Because we can talk about how much is lost, but in how much do we actually need to spend to help communities rebuild and, gain some sense of normalcy again. Going back to the spare standards, they are humanitarian standards that integrate all vulnerable groups. And using that as a guide, I think there's some very vital tools within it that can really help us build targeted interventions. So the big thing about recovery and immediate response is that it must be timely. And what some islands do struggle with is being able to quickly provide aid to people after a disaster. And sometimes there are environmental elements that prevent that, you know? So some communities are still flooded, so it's not safe to access. In the case of the Bahamas, providing aid means that it's coming from another island. And so the weather tends to be bad for a couple of days after a storm, so you can't fly in and you can't access by boat. So timely recovery is very important. And when we want to provide timely recovery, that means we need to be fully prepared with the essentials: food, water, medicines, baby supplies, baby food. All these different things need to be fully there and ready to be able to distribute to people in need. And because immediately after a storm, emotions are high. And readily so, people feel anxious, you know, and when they're not feeling like they're being cared for immediately, then things get to become a little bit more a tough situation than it actually needs to be. And I feel like that is one way that we can definitely strengthen our post-recovery efforts, is putting a greater focus on that timely response. And then also when it comes to reconstruction, if we understood the type of communities that exist, the type of buildings that exist, the level of potential damage that can exist, then we can properly plan for reconstruction efforts. And making that equitable and effective means that you're really providing aid to everybody who needs it. The interesting thing about disasters is that it puts everybody on the same scale, right? Immediately, everybody is probably lost something. And so when it comes to providing aid, it's good to consider all aspects of society and all members of society.
Kendria, you have the lived experience of hurricanes as a native of Bahamas, but you also have your academic grounding as you are currently pursuing your PhD studies at UWI Mona Sustainable Development Institute, where you focus on the socio-economic impact of natural disasters within the Bahamian context, particularly at the community level. And you have already given us some great insights into the community aspect of disaster risk management. Can you share any examples of successful community-led disaster preparedness initiatives?
I think community-led disaster preparedness initiatives is really focused on that community engagement. So is looking at the community to ensure that they understand what hazards exist and what vulnerabilities actually exist within that community and within those households. And it's working with all levels of society, right? So you have decision makers, you have community leaders, you have civil society, and all of everybody coming together to come up with a plan, to understand these are the issues that this community face, and these how they can potentially be impacted by a flood, by a hurricane, by a volcano eruption, a tsunami. Like these are the potential risks to this community. And so when you talk about community-led disaster preparedness, it's really letting the community have those conversations and be a big player at the table with making those decisions on how governments handle disaster events in the future.
So, what advice would you give the policymakers in the Caribbean regarding hurricane preparedness and general climate resilience?
My big advice will be we don't need any more talking, we need action. Very often, governments travel to international meetings and they have these groundbreaking speeches about how their countries are being impacted. And then when they return, the decisions doesn't align with the speech. It doesn't align with the major concerns that they previously had. And my big advice is to do what's best for your community and really have it human focus. That means making development decisions. That means changing building codes and regulations. That means having much more directed social protection measures. That means investing money in education and healthcare systems. That means using tax dollars for the purpose that it's supposed to be used for. And when you have purposeful governance, then you can build public trust, you can build public engagement and partnerships. And that's probably what we really need right now in order to help all communities and all people to really build their resilience to these storms and other hazards that we are currently being faced with.
We definitely need strong and decisive action. I'm really grateful for you sharing your insights, Kendria, today about building resilience in the Caribbean to not only hurricanes, but there are many other hazards that we experience within our region, and especially highlighting a focus on communities where the real cost of these disasters are felt. I completely support the bottom-up approach and ensuring that resources and finances are directed to the community level, as well as acknowledging the important role of civil society. Yes, our governments do have an important role, but as you mentioned, they are often not flexible or agile enough to respond to immediate needs. And that's where our civil society steps in and fills the gap. So we need to ensure that these NGOs and community-based organizations are well resourced because they play an invaluable role. And you also shared some strategies in terms of mapping communities, being able to understand the risk, and having access to timely data. We're only at the start of the 2024 hurricane season. And while we do hope and pray that we don't see another Beryl-like hurricane, we still have to prepare for the worst. So as we wrap up today's episode, Kendria, in your view, what would make the world a better place?
I can be cliche and say world peace.
Yeah.
But I think our worlds need better collaboration, especially within the region. The level of support that we are able to lend each other, not only in times of disasters, but development purposes, education, healthcare. We saw it during COVID. I think that would make us such a stronger region and also individually make our country stronger. We call ourselves a family, and sometimes we don't feed and we don't nurture that partnership, that collaboration, that shared culture and history enough. And I would change your question and be like, what will make our region a better place would be a stronger collaboration and partnership between our islands. And of course, if they fix interregional travel, that would be a big one for me as well.
I'm with you on that for sure. Interregional travel is a long-standing headache, so I do have hope that we can get it right. It was a big topic post-COVID, but it kind of died out.
Certainly did, yeah.
So, Kendria, how can listeners connect with you and keep up with your research?
I am on LinkedIn. That seems to be the most that I'm active right now. There's too much social media channels for my liking. But I'm on LinkedIn, Kendria Ferguson. You can find me on there.
So thank you so much, Kendria, for joining me today on the Climate Conscious podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to the Climate Conscious podcast. We hope you found today's episode interesting, informative, and inspiring. Visit theclimateconscious.com for more info. I'm Derval Bazi, and this is the Climate Conscious podcast.